Nikon Z9 after using it for 6 months. I use this camera, guys, for about 6 months now, and I'm not getting paid by Nikon to say what I'm about to say. This video is not sponsored, and these are my thoughts and my thoughts only. I use this camera for photo and video extensively for a good half a year now, and for paid work as well as for personal work. I took this to vacations, a ton of family events, sports, wildlife, commercial shoots, and more. You guys might want to grab a cup of coffee or tea and sit back and watch this video because it's probably going to be a little bit lengthy. So let me start to talk about the negatives of this camera, because a lot of reviewers I'm noticing sometimes leave this until the end, but let me just put it right in the front and share with you my experience using this camera and some of the things that I but I did not like specifically and maybe took me by surprise. And there's actually only one particular issue, and this has to do with the USB-C port back on the side of a camera. I took this camera on vacation and I took a specific cable with me, USB-C to USB-A, I want to say, and I used the power bank that I've used in the past as well for any other cameras to charge. The problem is I wasn't able to charge the camera. For some reason, the camera wasn't accepting the charge from the power bank. Then I plugged in that USB-C cable into the outlet, and still the same problem. So this might be a problem with the USB-C outlet, USB-C port itself. Now, second issue that I experienced with this is when I use the cable that I used to transfer files to my computer, to Mac, using Nikon transfer software on the computer. For some reason, software wasn't recognizing the camera. And I used that software and the cable in the past, it was fine. But at some point, it stopped recognizing it. So, don't know why, but this port froze on me. And the only thing that I was able to do was to actually reset the camera to the initial specifications of, by the manufacturer, and that's the only thing that really saved me to start using it back again. Other than that, no issues, no complaints, but something happened with the USB-C port. And if you guys have any similar experiences, please let me know in the comments below so that maybe I'll learn from you and you learn from me, and that's a shared experience. All right, so let me cut to the chase. This is probably the best in class camera on the market, mirrorless camera. It's hard to go over every single feature of this camera because I probably will need 24 hours just to cover all the extensive features and the menu that this camera has to offer. I was fortunate enough to get this camera in January 22, and my local camera store called me and they said that my Z9 was in stock and I was able to go pick it up. Now, what's in this review is actually going to be based a lot on the content and questions that you guys asked me on my previous videos, and I'm going to kind of break it down and share with you my experience using this camera for last 6 months. Now, guys, if you don't want to listen through all of the features that I'll be covering with this camera, I would suggest that you skip down to the chapters below and maybe zoom in particular topics that you might be interested in, so you don't have to sit through the entire video. Now, a quick story how I arrived to Z9. I started shooting Nikon probably over a decade ago by now, and my first Nikon DSLR camera was the 5000, one of those crop sensor cameras. Then I moved on to the 5500, then to the 7000, then to the 800, and then to the 500. From that point, which was probably one of my favorite cameras at that time, Nikon Z6 came out. So I kind of waited for the second version, and I purchased Nikon Z6 II, which actually recording me right now with the 24-70 f2.8. And from that point, I fell in love with most of the features that Nikon mirrorless cameras were offering. And I felt pretty confident to jump and actually grab the Z9, and using this for the past 6 months, it has been really one fantastic camera. So during the last 6 months, I've shot portraits, landscapes, vacations. I've taken this camera on the cruise, birthday parties, indoors, outdoors, using a flash, natural light, high-speed sync flash, fashion, sports, corporate video interviews, which was awesome, behind the scenes of a music video that my friend put together, real estate photography, concerts, kids performances, worship services, wildlife, and this is actually where this camera shines. Now, it's not the most extensive review that I've done with wildlife, but I've tested enough with the bird IAF, and this camera is just brilliant. So let's get this out of the way. So the camera price is not cheap. It's $5,500, which equates to about 7,000 Canadian dollars. Now let's go through the camera itself. Let's talk a little bit about the body. So what we have here is, as I mentioned earlier, we got USB-C and we have HDMI full-size cable, which is an awesome feature for this camera because you no longer have to be dealing with smaller cables, and this is the cable that I personally used. Actually, this cable rated for 8K because, as you know, this camera shoots in 8K as well, and it's just so much easier to be able to use this. One of the cool functions of this camera is that when you have your, let's say, Ninja recorder attached to the top of a camera and connected, you actually can press record button, and it also records at the same time on the Ninja 5. So one little feature I discovered, and that was a pretty pleasant surprise. So of course what we have here is your mic jack, which is great to attach microphones. Actually, the microphone itself on the camera is pretty good. Of course, you have your headphone jack and you have your transfer port. Let's talk a little bit about the card slots. So Nikon Z9 uses 2 card slots, XQD as well as CF Express. So in my experience, it's great to have both for this camera. You also have a Kensington lock on this camera, the horizontal and vertical grip. Now this is, for me personally, it's probably one of the favorite features of this camera is actually ergonomics, because when I purchased Z6 II, the camera felt a little too small for my hand. So when I moved on to the Z9, it really designed perfectly for my hand. And I would say I have a pretty good size hands. And but one of the more interesting features is that actually the vertical grip, it's actually more comfortable, again, for me personally, than the horizontal grip. So you have articulated screen that goes up and down, okay? And it's a 4-way tilting screen. It's not a fully articulated screen like, for example, you have on the R5 and R6, but this camera has also this tilting option, okay, which is really handy for low light portraits, and I really used it quite a bit. So very, very neat feature. You got rubberized dials on the camera. So when the Z6 II and Z7 came out, mirrorless cameras, they had more of a metallic feel on them. Now on the Z9, kind of going back to, you know, D850, D6, D5, you have rubberized dials on both sides, front and back, and that's kind of was a welcoming feature back for the camera. You have a top LCD screen. One of the interesting things that I discovered on the LCD screen is that if you're in a photo mode, the camera will tell you how much time you have left, how many pictures you have left to take. Now, when you're on a video mode, it's actually how many minutes you have left, and that actually shows when the camera is turned off. So that actually was a very nice little feature to have that, again, I didn't see anybody comment or talk about it in the past. As far as the on and off button is, it's really located right in the front up here, okay? And the camera turns on and off instantaneously. That's again one of the nice features back here, is that once you turn it on, it turns off. Once you turn it off, it turns off. For somebody who is a professional photographer, it is an important feature because it actually can cost you your shot. Now, I'm not a big fan on cameras like I think R5 and R6, where your power button has basically in a different zip code on the other side of the camera, and you always have to use two hands to kind of to turn and turn off the camera. Like on the Nikon, it's basically right in the front, and it is virtually instantaneous compared to the Z6 and Z7. Now, as far as the camera weight, the camera weighs 2.6 pounds, and which is 1,160 grams. And if you put in the battery itself, as well as one card, then you have 2.9 pounds, which is 1,340 grams. I would say the camera size and weight is relatively reasonable given to what's packed in this camera. My wife was able to hold this camera actually on one of the, when we were at the beach, basically with one hand, and I had a Z50, I'm sorry, the 50mm f1.8 attached to it, and she had no problems holding it with one hand. Now, if you're carrying this camera for most of the day for, let's say, like a wedding event or something, yeah, it's gonna get a little bit heavy, so you might want to put it down from time to time to rest your hand. Now let's talk a little bit about the processor. So the camera uses XP7 processor, which is capable of calculating 120 cycles per second. This processor is actually, I guess Nikon claims, is 8 to 10 times faster than its predecessor cameras of the Z6 and Z7 II. I have no way of verifying whether these numbers are accurate, but given the functionality and speed that this camera works with, I can definitely lean towards saying that yes, it is 2 times, 3 times, 4 times probably faster than the processor in a Z6 II and Z7 II. Now, one of the questions was asked, how's the image sensor compared to previous cameras? So in my experience, this is my first 45 megapixel camera, and it's a backside illuminated stacked image sensor, which has a really fast readout and scan speed. So it actually has a 52.37 megapixels, but given the size of the opening that we actually have our lenses attached to, it's effective 45.7 megapixels. So, rounding down to 45 megapixel camera, and this is what we have here. The image quality of the sensor is absolutely beautiful, in my opinion. That's actually one of the things that many of my viewers previously commented on, the fact that they ended up switching from previous camera systems to Nikon because they're in love with colors. JPEGs specifically, and obviously when you shoot in RAW, you can virtually massage the file in any way you desire and get the same results with any camera. But even with JPEG colors, out of the box, the file sizes and the rendering of the images and lenses, flexibility of RAW files, it's really phenomenal. So I am very pleased with the image sensor itself. Now, next question is, how are the JPEGs itself and RAW files? So as far as the RAW files, the camera has 3 different functions. One of them is lossless compressed, which basically has the highest resolution files in RAW. And then you have high efficiency star. That's the one I typically shoot, and it's 30 to 40% smaller files than the lossless compressed. So I'm actually been very pleased with the file sizes you get in RAW. And then you have also high efficiency, which I typically don't use. But again, with 45 megapixel sensor, you get pretty good size files, anywhere from 20 to 30 megabytes in size. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the autofocus of this camera. So the camera uses people cars and animals, as well as sort of a combined mode where you have all three of them. For the most part, given my type of work, I primarily shoot portraits and weddings. I keep the camera for the most part on eye detect for people. And compared to the Z6 and Z7, it's, I wouldn't say it's light years away, but it's significantly improved compared to those previous cameras for Nikon. And compared to R5, I would say, in my experience, I've shot with the R5 enough, the Z9 has a better focusing capability. And when it comes to sports and using the sort of, longer telephoto lenses, I had such a good success, such a high hit rate when it comes to sharpness, and it's just spectacular. So I am very, very pleased with the way the IAF works. I don't know if it can be actually any better. Okay, now I use IAF in video right now with the Z6 II, and it works just fine. But again, I'm stationary. When you have a subject moving fast, it is harder to keep up with those cameras. With the Z9, it's not a problem. Okay, it's not a problem. Absolutely beautifully captures the eye when it comes to, even for the running subjects, when it comes to people. Now, guys, if you are a birder and you are here hoping to hear something about the bird photography, I do have a limited experience with birds, but I would like to send you to someone who is very good and has a lot of information. Is actually two YouTubers. One of them is Chuck from AP Studios, who has a lot of guests on his shows, as well as Vahagan from Vahography. I'm going to link both of their channels in the description box below. I would suggest that you guys subscribe, watch their videos. They have a lot of comments. They have weekly shows, which I personally learned a lot from them. And I would suggest that you watch their videos. They talk about all kinds of Nikon cameras, and Z9 in particular in many ways. They have a lot of guests who they invite, and they have a lot of good things to say when it comes to bird photography with the Z9. Okay, so how is the ISO on this camera? So the lowest ISO on this one is 64 and goes up to 25,000 and change. And it's fantastic. If you're coming from something like a D850 or Z7, Z7 II, where you're familiar with the low ISO of 64, where you have an extended dynamic range with the camera, the Z9 will not disappoint you. Okay, so it's going from 64 to 25,600, and I usually don't shoot this high. I've gone up to about 16,000 ISO, and I do have some grain show up in the files. Now those can be mitigated by different software, but again, I usually remain under about 12,000 ISO, and the files are still usable. Okay, so what are my thoughts when it comes to the electronic shutter on this camera? I have done actually an extensive review of this camera, as well as Nikon Z6 II of a mechanical shutter, and I compared both of them. Z9 has 1/32,000 of a second electronic shutter speed. Z6 II has the highest 1/8,000, and I'm gonna link it right up here in the corner that you guys can check out the video and just be the judge. There are some files eventually when you get to 1/32,000 and you have some skipping lines when it comes to shooting in a low light environment, but this camera has no problems capturing with electronic shutter. Again, it's very clean. I think it's the future of most of the cameras, going eventually with electronic shutter when you have a faster readout sensors, and I think this is what we're going to see in the future. Okay, so how is the continuous shooting when it comes to sports and wildlife? As I mentioned, I am not primarily specializing in those areas. I have shot sports for my son's soccer. I've done some wildlife, and so the camera shoots up to 20 frames per second at 45 megapixels, and then it goes down to 30 frames per second at 45 megapixels when it comes to in JPEGs. And again, I typically don't shoot this high, so if you guys want to hear what it sounds like. So let me turn my camera into the, and also camera shoots at 120 frames per second photos with JPEGs, unfortunately. So if it's important to you, that's maybe one of the drawbacks that you may find. But again, I never shoot this high because I just don't know what to do with so many files. Now, if you guys want to see what it sounds like when it comes to the 20 frames per second, 30 frames per second, this is what it sounds like. So this was 20 frames per second. Now let's switch the camera to 30 frames per second. This is 30. And now let me switch to 120 frames per second. This is what it sounds like. It's actually pretty much the same as the 30 frames per second. I think it has to do with the internal speaker, and it's more of a mechanical sound that the camera makes, or electronic sound the camera makes. So between 30 frames per second and 120 frames per second, it sounds exactly the same. But again, the camera shoots phenomenally in all of those modes, and somebody who is a sports photographer and they need this 120 frames per second, it's a nice feature to have. All right, so next thing I wanted to cover is people ask me, how's the FTZ adapter on the Z9? So I have been using the FTZ adapter with the 85mm f1.8 lens, and this is a G version. So this lens for the most part lives on this FTZ adapter, and I've had a great success using this lens. Even for, again, sports photography in a DX mode, the camera tracks phenomenally, and now somebody will ask, well, why would you use this lens for sports photography? Now, simply, my kids play soccer. It's not a huge field, so I have enough reach with this lens, and I've had a really good luck with using this FTZ adapter. Some people said, well, so how does this work specifically when it comes to the FTZ adapter? Because there's this little foot up here, right? So there we go, that's the little foot. Because it probably comes in conflict when you turn the camera sideways. Okay, so right, when you turn the camera sideways, and it kind of prevents you from putting your fingers right inside up here. But again, I found it's not a big issue. My pinky fits normally in size up here, and I don't think I have a need to switch to the version 2 of the FTZ adapter, because version 1 works just fine for me. So if you have maybe bigger fingers and that might be an issue for you, that's something you might want to consider. I think the cost of the FTZ adapter is about $250, but the version 1 works just fine. From what I'm hearing, there are no differences when it comes to functionality of the FTZ adapter. All right, so next thing about is the lenses. So what I've been using on my camera with the Z9 is, again, I'm a portrait photographer. I'm not a wildlife and sports photographer, so I'm not looking to necessarily dive in with this camera when it comes to the longer lenses. But I have been using, and this is probably my favorite setup, is the 50mm f1.8 S lens. And this camera and lens combo is very, very sweet. I would imagine probably the 35mm lens or 85mm lens will be very similar when it comes to the S line. It's very light, it's very handy. I've used this for video work extensively, and I gotta tell you, the lenses function with this camera just like one piece. I have absolutely no complaints. I also use the 24-70 f2.8 S lens, which actually recording me right now on this camera. It gets a little bit heavy to hold for an extended period of time, but it's not terrible. Again, consider the case user that you have, and the new Z lenses are just work very, very well. And I had very similar success actually with this f-mount lens, 85mm f1.8 G version. No problems. The only difference when it comes to, if you want to record a video, you're going to hear a little focusing motor sound on this G lens, as opposed to on this lens or 24-70 Z lens, you don't hear any of that because it's very, very silent. Now, one other function that I want to quickly mention here is, and that's been helpful for a lot of people, people have been pleased, is having the sensor shield. Okay, now this is not a shutter, this is a sensor shield, and it works very nicely and quickly. As soon as you open the camera, let's see if I can focus on this one. As soon as you flip the switch, it closes and opens right away. Okay, especially if you're switching the lenses somewhere, you are at the beach and there's a lot of sand. This is a nice feature to have. And one thing just to note is when you get this camera from the very beginning, this function is not turned on. You actually have to go to the menu and turn this sensor shield that it can be on in the menu if you want to have it. All right, so the next feature that I want to talk to you guys about is how customizable this camera actually is. So as you know, you might have seen the camera has 4 function custom buttons, basically 1, 2, 3, and 4 in the back. The way I customize the camera is I subdivide it on 2 sections, one for video and the second one for photo. As far as the photo is, I have my function 1 button set up as a play button, and the reason I did this because Nikon cameras are very notorious when they design a new body for camera, they would place the play button in different locations based on how the camera is supposed to function. So this function 1 button is actually in a very handy location because when I take a picture, if I need to see what it looks like, instead of me trying to remember based on how I use different cameras where the play button is, it's always underneath my finger. So this is very handy. I actually do the same thing for video. So the function 1 for photo and video serves the same purpose as a play button. The second function button that I have here is for star mode, for photography. And what the star mode does is, in a low light situations, when you want to be able to see and help camera to focus better, you can simply click function 1 button like this, and the star function will appear. Basically, it will display the sensor much brighter. As far as the function 3 button, I have it set for flash photography. So when I need to use my flash, basically, it's either I'm going to use my Godox AD200, or if I'm going to use, along with my X2T trigger, basically I would need to turn the camera into flash mode that will allow me to trigger my flash. Or the same way, if you want to put any of the flashes on top of a camera, in my case I use SB700, been using for probably over a decade by now, and it works perfectly. You basically also have to be using that to turn your flash mode on. And as far as the function 4 button, which is back up here in the back of the camera, I use that function to set picture control. Okay, so these are my photography function buttons. As far as video, as I just mentioned earlier, I use a function 1 as my play button right over here. I use my function 2 button to be able to change from a full frame to DX mode if I want to have a little bit of a closer view of a subject. For function 3 button, I use the grid or kind of rule of thirds if I need to be able to place the subject and frame it in the proper location. That helps me to kind of display on and off. And for function 4, for video, I use this one as a set picture control. So that's kind of how I set up my buttons here, function buttons, but you can customize however you want to. And the fact that it's a button rather than some kind of a slider, it gives you that tactile feel that you actually get an instant feedback when you know if you pressed it or not. So these are awesome function buttons, and I use them very frequently when I do photo and video. All right, so let's talk about one of the biggest announcements when this camera came out was the 8K recording. So I probably underutilize this camera for 8K recording because the file sizes are gigantic. For probably about 30 to 45 seconds of video, I get about 1 gigabyte of data with this file. So I definitely see it's being helpful for places if you need to do like a landscape video, or if you need to do a wildlife video with some kind of like a telephoto lens where you want to see the details of an animal or an insect or something. That is a great function, and you can really have a nice reach. Now, for me personally, I don't use 8K as much. I do use the 8K downsample to 4K, which the file sizes are spectacular. So I would highly recommend for that specific use. And that's kind of where my 8K usage ends. Again, I'm probably underutilizing that specific function. Next question that I get is, how is the autofocus in video mode? I gotta tell you, it is absolutely spectacular when the camera is coupled with an Z mount lens, such as 50mm f1.8 or 35mm or 85 prime lenses. The camera functions like I have never seen before. It functions just as well as R5 and R6 and R3, as well as A1. It really has very dynamic feel to it, and you can choose how quickly you want for the camera to focus, be with subject when it comes to video. So this is a really cinema machine when it comes to using it for video, and I am trying to get into more of cinematography and doing videos. One of my latest projects that I used this camera for was a corporate photo shoot where everything was recorded in auto mode. And when I say everything, I mean the IAF, and it's been really handy. As far as the type of video recording format that this camera has, it does 8K, as you know, it does 4K up to 120 frames per second. Now, with the firmware 2.0, which was a huge update to the camera starts actually having in the back of the camera, once you hit the record button, you have a red box all around the screen. And this is very handy for someone who, if you're using the video once in a while, sometimes you don't know if you hit the record button. So that allows me to kind of really see, all right, I did hit record button. It kind of gives that visual confirmation. All right, so another question that I get is, okay, how about overheating with this camera? In my experience, I used it indoors with normal temperature conditions, as well as outdoors with 85-degree temperature, recording a 4K and 8K. I have not had a problem with overheating. The camera is capable of recording up to 2 hours, and I want to say 5 minutes. And in my experience, I never had a problem with overheating with this camera. If you had a problem with this camera before when it comes to overheating, please comment in the description below so that the rest of the viewers can be more informed of maybe you've had different examples. All right, so one of the things that I did not talk about is the battery life of the camera. And I gotta tell you, when it comes to the battery life, look how huge this battery is, okay? Compared to the Z6, Z7 battery size, this battery lasts a long time. It is EN-EL 18 rechargeable battery. You can actually charge the battery, as I mentioned earlier, through the USB-C port. It is extremely good. It's excellent for 700 to 800 shots at least. If you're using it in the burst mode for like sports photography and wildlife, you're gonna have up to 1,000 shots easily. So there are no complaints when it comes to the battery size. And I think I mentioned earlier is that I had a problem with the USB-C port. For some reason it froze and wouldn't allow me to charge my camera. So that was a bummer, but perhaps maybe it was a bug and will be addressed in the future firmware update. As far as the camera tilting screen, as you know, this is basically a 4-axis tilting screen, touch screen LCD. It's not fully articulated like you would see on R5 and R6 and R3. It's my personal preference is actually having this style as opposed to having it be fully articulated, because when I'm looking at my subject, and whether it's for photo or video, and when I'm primarily behind the camera, I want to have my axis be in the center of the subject as well when I'm looking down. So it's really a personal preference. It's a 3.2 inch 2.1 2.1 million dot resolution screen. It is excellent for video and photography, so there are no complaints when it comes to the screen resolution and size. How is the electronic viewfinder? For somebody who is coming maybe from DSLRs, where you guys used optical viewfinder and everything is clear, electronic viewfinder is very similar to the LCD screen, basically in the back, except it's only half-inch size. And all of the data that you see in the back here, once you put your eye to the eyepiece, you see all this information. It's really a small little screen, and there's no blackout when it comes to shooting sports and wildlife. It is really spectacular. It is, you know, another version of optical viewfinder on steroids with just kind of looking through the television screen. So great function. Now, what about the flash speed sync? So the camera has 1/200 flash speed sync, and it's probably not the highest in the industry, but it's sufficient enough when it comes to be able to freeze a subject. Now, if you need to use a higher flash speed sync, you can use a HSS, high speed sync, and I'm going to put a video up in the corner here above, kind of showing how I use it and how to set up the camera for the high speed sync, and it works great. I use it outdoors for a fashion photo shoot in New York, and it worked flawlessly for me. So again, I use my AD200 for high speed sync, and that worked really good for me. And one of the things that I kind of briefly mentioned earlier is the ergonomics on this camera. The camera has absolutely beautiful ergonomics when it comes to horizontally, but once you flip it to vertical side, it's even a better handling of the camera. In fact, simply when I'm walking around and I'm carrying my camera, a lot of times I will be holding the camera like this instead of holding camera like that, because like my full hand is actually able to grab the camera, and where you have the AF on button in the back for your thumb, it's really it's perfectly designed for my hand. And you know, again, this is the size of my hand, kind of the average size. It's not small, it's not huge, but it works very well ergonomically, and I really love the fact that, you know, the screen now tilts like this basically in the vertical position, and I can actually shoot in low for the low situations like this. So spectacular, no complaints whatsoever. So who is this camera for? I would definitely say it's absolutely for sports and wildlife photographer. If you're using a D5, D6, D500 and you have been contemplating whether this might be a camera for you, it absolutely is. It will take you to a new level. Again, I'm not paid by Nikon to say what I'm saying right now. It's just I paid full price for this camera myself, and I am fully enjoying it. This camera is also for someone who is maybe a wedding or a portrait photographer, because this is a 45 megapixel sensor. If you are shooting landscapes, if you are shooting portraits and you need to have a level of detail that this camera provides, it will be absolutely a winner in your experience. So great camera for all types of photographers and videographers. Now, I would say that who this camera is not for, and somebody who is into vlogging, right? Because it's obviously you don't have an articulating screen, so you can see yourself in the back, so that you can properly frame yourself. And but again, camera is not made for that. Okay, so if you're looking for vlogging type camera that Nikon makes is Z30 just recently came out, or Z50. So those cameras are great for vlogging, has a great IAF, and you'll be happy with grabbing one of those cameras. You know, yes, it probably would be nice to have some additional features on this camera. You know, somebody might want to say, I would like to have a fully articulated screen in this camera, just for, you know, somebody who really prefers that. But, you know, some of my wild ideas that I personally had was, how great would that be that if we have an internal storage on cameras? You know, it's 2022. Our cell phones have been having internal storage for over a decade at this point, and I don't know why it hasn't transitioned to cameras. I think Hasselblad now is coming out, or already might have come out with a camera that has an internal storage of 1 terabyte, which is awesome. And you know, if you forgot your screen, if you forgot your card and you need to be able to record something, you got a place to record on external storage. You know, one of the wild ideas that I personally had was maybe having a front LCD screen where if you want to frame yourself and if you're recording somewhere out in the public or something, at least it will help you with framing, kind of like what GoPro cameras have, GoPro 10, let's say, to have a little screen here in the front. That'll be a neat feature to have as well. It is hard to cover the capabilities of this camera in just one video. I have been producing Nikon Z9 content for some time, addressing features of this camera one at a time. I'm sure that I have not covered all of the features that the camera has to offer. But I'll be honest, it's not easy because there's so much packed inside of a menu for photo and video. There's a reason why there's so much content, you know, to cover different small subject of this camera, because there's just so much information that's being packed in this camera alone. This camera is geared towards most type of photographers and filmmakers. That's why, in my opinion, I think this is one of the best hybrid cameras on the market today. If you have any questions in relation to this camera, please put it down in the comments below. I'll be happy to provide response, feedback, test different features, and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Hit that like button as it helps algorithm of YouTube, and it will help me to know if you're interested or not, so that I can make more content like this for viewers like you. Thank you.